You can have a roll call, please.
Councilmember Kusamoto.
Here.
Councilmember Murphy. Absent. Councilmember Wilson.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Edgar.
Here.
Mayor Hasselbrink.
Here. All right, this time we're going to be doing the mid-year general fund budget review for fiscal 2016-2017 and the preliminary for 2017-2018. I'll quickly open it up for public comments. And seeing none. Jason, it's all yours.
Okay, I'll introduce this. Madam Mayor and City Council, thank you for allowing us this opportunity to present the fiscal year 16-17 mid-year budget review and fiscal year 17-18 kickoff of the budget. And this, Jason Alamitos, the Administrative Services Director, will go through the timing, talk about a little bit of the process, and go through a review of this year and heading into the kickoff for next fiscal year. And it's all a focus on the general fund at this point. So here's Jason to start it off.
So good evening, Mayor and members of the council. I wanted to first apologize. I have a bit of a sore throat, so if I'm struggling a little bit, bear with me. And so as Brett mentioned, tonight we'll be going over the 2016-17 mid-year review. At this point, we're 7 months, 8 months into the fiscal year. And so we look back at the year and look how our revenue assumptions are looking and forecast the remainder of the fiscal year. And it gives us an opportunity to kind of recalibrate those assumptions. And then at the same time, since we're digging into the revenues and expenditures, we have put together a preliminary budget for the general fund for the upcoming fiscal year 2017-18. And so that provides us with an opportunity to look at where those revenues and expenditures are headed. So I wanted to kind of explain the primary purpose of the mid-year, like I said, is to revisit those assumptions. And there's a number of scenarios and assumptions that are built into the forecast. And to the extent that those need to be revisited as the year unfolds, we will be bringing back this item to the Budget Standing Committee and to the City Council later on in the fiscal year. So for 2016-17, the general fund is projected to have a surplus of $194,000. Approximately $129,000 of that relates to revenues, and approximately $65,000 of that relates to expenditures. And that is projected to bring fund balance to approximately $7.6 million. So on the revenue side, while there are variances for all revenue categories, I wanted to highlight a couple of things and bring those to your attention. First, with sales and use tax revenue. Sales and use tax revenue is projected to be up approximately $78,000 for the fiscal year, but that's primarily due to several large one-time adjustments. In fact, there was a large single one-time adjustment in the amount of $52,700, which related to a reallocation of use tax through the county pool for use tax revenue that was mistakenly reported to another city in prior years. So what that does is that provides an inflow of revenues in the current year, but because it's one-time in nature, it will not carry on into the base line of projected growth for sales tax revenue. Second, I wanted to bring your attention to utility users tax revenue, which is projected to be down approximately $105,000. This is primarily related to electric utility revenue. And in discussions with Edison, they have indicated that this is primarily the result of a retroactive credit that was applied to commercial customer accounts from the period of April 2016 to November 2016. And the credit relates to a statewide cap and trade program. This is impacting all cities, not just the city of Los Alamitos. So cities like Seal Beach and Stanton that have an electric utility tax are seeing the same similar declines in their revenues as well. And so that's impacting our revenue base for the current year. I also wanted to bring your attention to licenses and permit revenue. So in 16-17, there were several unexpected land use applications filed for various multifamily unit developments and fees related to the Village 605. And so that has increased the projected license and permit revenue for the current year of 2016-17. And so in total, revenues are projected to be at approximately $13,126,000, approximately $129,000 better than originally budgeted. Now turning over to the expenditure side, I wanted to first start off and explain that when we adopted the original budget in June, the original budget included salary savings of $115,000. What that means is salary savings, we know that every year we have attrition and we have retirements, and so we know that we will be able to realize savings in that staffing turnover because it takes time to fill those vacancies. And so because of that, when we were putting together the budget for 2016-17, we built into the budget those salary savings. And so we've realized those salary savings primarily in the police department. There was a sergeant retirement, and then there was temporary vacancies at an officer level and a corporal level. And so since those savings have been realized in the police department, the salary savings or the negative budget has been applied to that department, and therefore it looks like they're at budget, but in reality they've contributed to that baseline expected of $115,000 of salary savings. And then above and beyond that, we've had additional salary savings. So in recreation, for example, we had a recreation coordinator leave a couple months ago, and so we have savings associated with that. We have a department secretary position that's been vacant for the fiscal year, and so we have savings associated with that. We also have savings in development services associated with the departure of the public services superintendent. However, those savings have been offset with other cost increases associated with water cost and tree trimming costs. But overall, it's projected to still be below budget, approximately $65,000 for the current year of 2016-17. So now, as we turn over to 2017-18, I wanted to point out a couple of things. First, the preliminary budget, it has a $274,000 budget gap. But this is different from last year in the sense that the 2016 budget included the salary savings of $115,000. But for 2017-18, we've not accounted for any salary savings. And in fact, one of our potential gap closure measures is to build that into the base budget and at least temporarily freeze full-time and part-time vacancies, which would create approximately $280,000 of savings. I also wanted to point out that no new positions have been added to the base budget. This really just assumes status quo and continuing to offer the same level of service that our residents have been provided with in the past. So on the revenue side, property tax revenue is growing at approximately the rate of 3%, and that's due to growth in assessed values. Sales tax revenues are actually up on an economic basis, but because of those one-time adjustments that we discussed previously in the current year, when you factor those out, it results in a net year-over-year cash decline in that revenue base. And then licenses and permit revenue, wanted to point out that while it's relatively flat overall year to year, we've actually built into the 2017-18 preliminary budget anticipated plan check fees and building permit fee revenue associated with the Village 605. And, but that's offset with those multifamily unit developments that we talked about that have affected 16-17. So the net result is basically a wash from year to year. So overall, it's about $25,000 higher projected for 2017-18 compared to the projected amount for 2016-17. But when we turn over, well, first, I wanted to kind of talk about property tax revenue. So property tax revenue is our single largest source of revenue. In fact, it accounts for 28% of general fund revenues. In fact, since 2012, we've seen steady growth at an average pace of 4% per year. Sales tax is our second largest source of revenue. It's approximately 25% of general fund revenues. And excluding those one-time aberrations in 2015-16 and in 2016-17, we've seen actually very strong growth at an average rate of 5.8% over the last 9 years. It's slowed in recent years, but still we've seen very strong growth. So on the expenditure side, when we compare the preliminary budget to the projected amounts for 2016-17, we're seeing a $465,000 increase. And as I mentioned, part of that relates to the fact that we have not built into the base budget vacancy savings. And we could build in approximately $280,000 of vacancy savings based upon a number of vacancies that exist citywide. And that would allow us time to actually perform an organizational study and to look at the citywide structure for staffing and services, and to look for opportunities for savings. On top of the $280,000 of vacancy savings, there are PERS costs that we're being forced to absorb into the current year. So PERS costs have increased to the tune of $115,000. That's in addition to the cost increases that we've absorbed in prior years. And then, so if you take the $280,000 for the salary savings, $115,000 for those pension cost increases, and then approximately $88,000 for citywide cost of living adjustments and merit increases, that's $483,000. That basically explains the year-over-year increase in the 2017-18 preliminary budget. This slide just kind of highlights high level what I just discussed. Also wanted to bring to your attention the fact that we will be having budget workshops in March and April before the regularly scheduled meetings to do an overview of each department's budget and to explain how those dollars serve the community, kind of like we've done in the past. And so we'll be able to dig deeper into each department's budget and analyze those budget dollars in March and April. I mentioned the increases in pension costs, and this slide it really tells the story in terms of where we've been and where we're headed. You know, since 2009, pension costs annually have been about $1 million annually, and then in 2015-16, PERS started this ramp up. What they did was they shortened the amortization period to 30 years. Prior to that, it was a rolling 30-year period, which you might equate that to if you had a mortgage and you had a 30-year mortgage, and at the end of each year you refinanced and re-extended the term out 30 years. That's effectively how the pension program worked prior to 2015. Beginning in 2015-16, CalPERS fixed that amortization period, and in fact, they even shortened it to 19 years. And so That's good in a sense because it means that we'll be paying down the pension liability over a shorter period of time. On the flip side, it's difficult from a budgetary perspective absorbing that into our budget. In fact, when you look at the increase from 2015-16 to 2016-17 and then 2017-18, that's an increase in annual pension costs of $592,000. That's a 62% increase from where we were at in 2014-15. And it's been difficult to absorb. It's impacted every single year of our budgets over the last 3 years. And we're at 1.5 million in 2017-18. As you can see, over the next 5 years after that, it's projected to grow to approximately 3 million. And so in light of these escalating pension costs, the city is planning to develop a plan to try to tackle these rising pension costs. And also we're analyzing, like I said, city services and doing an organizational review in an effort to try to develop a long-term plan for fiscal sustainability, also putting together a 5-year revenue and expenditure forecast that will outline how our developments with the hotel development and Village 605 and forecasted revenues will impact, and then layering in these pension costs, how all of that will line up. And then, so we plan to bring that to the council later in the fiscal year. So the potential budget gap currently is $274,000. There's really, two proposed gap closure measures. One I mentioned is a temporary freeze on all vacant full-time and part-time positions, with the exception of those that are approved by the city manager. And that would buy us time to undergo this organizational study to then determine whether or not those temporary freezes should become permanent freezes, and if we can identify operational efficiencies and establish effectively a new base for that expenditure level, staffing level. And that would generate $280,000 of savings. In addition to that, we have recently finished a user fee study, and the results of that study reflect that we are not recovering at least $239,000 of costs related to services that are actually provided to residents and businesses currently. And so we'll be bringing that forward to the Budget Standing Committee on May 1st and the Council on May 15th to review the results of the study and the recommendations to recover those costs associated with those services. This last slide has a history of general fund revenues and expenditures. That's the the line, the green line and the red line, and then the blue bar chart is fund balance reserves, and you can see that those have grown over the years. In fact, in the year in 14-15, where it looks like it's a decline, we actually set aside 1.1 million out of the general fund and established 2 new capital internal service funds, and that was used to fund an 800 megahertz project and also a CAD RMS project. So based upon council action, we have consistently approved and balanced and maintained a balanced operating budget, and therefore the current chart includes the recommendations for those gap closure measures that would provide for a balanced budget, and would continue to provide for that into the future. This slide just outlines the future budget workshops that have been scheduled for the remainder of this fiscal year. So as I mentioned, in March and April, we will have the departments provide department overviews of their department. And then on May 1st, we will have the capital infrastructure workshop where we will discuss the capital needs of the city, since this is really just focused on general fund operating dollars. And then, of course, on May 15th, we'll be reviewing the user fee study results. And then June 5th is there just as a placeholder in case we need it. And then, of course, June 19th, the plan would be to adopt the budget at that time. So with that said, I'm available for any questions, and the staff recommendations is to receive and file the mid-year report and to direct staff regarding the potential gap closure items for the fiscal year 17-18.
Any discussion from council?
Just been sitting on the budget committee and going over this process. I've said it before, I'll say it again. This is a lot of hard work going into this too, so thank you, Jason, Brett, for your oversight on this. I know it does take a long time to get these right, and you guys have a very thorough analysis. Looking forward to the upcoming workshops. We're going to kind of explore more details. I don't personally like approving a budget that does show a deficit. I would like to see it balanced, and I am open to looking, and we should be open to looking at any of the budget gap closure measures that we would want to see as options. Just a couple of questions on here too, because you did outline about $280,000 in temporary freeze. Just to confirm, that would be for a full year of not hiring any of the open positions. So even though it could be temporary, that would be a full year's worth of savings.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
And then obviously the estimate of $239,000 for fee studies, for fee increases that we could come back. That'd be something we'd look at the overall fee study and whether that's actually obtainable if we did increase fees, that we still receive that same amount of revenue.
Right.
Okay.
Likely there may be a phased-in approach for the fee study recommendations, and so that it's possible we may not realize the entire $239,000, although that is a conservative amount that's been included.
Okay.
No questions. Thank you very much for the report.
Troy, do you have any comments or questions?
Yeah, I have a couple comments. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Yeah, I guess a couple things. So just a couple observations. The way that I was looking at this budget is mid-year review, I should say, is I broke it up into the three areas, and I'd like to just put my comments kind of across the three areas separately. Within the first part, the current budget for this year, really the mid-year, and kind of where we're at. Just a couple things. First of all, I wanted to thank staff for meeting with me before the meeting and going through all three components, the current, next year, and then the budget gap, and kind of how we close that. Within the current year, I would just say I'm very excited. I know where Josh or Councilmember Wilson is at regarding the deficit, but it definitely looking like with the amended budget that we ended up having about $193,000 addition to our reserves, and I think something that I've been very focused on being on the council is to try to get that reserve value back up to $8 million, so it's at 7.6. Just directionally, I think observationally, if you look through the rest of the report, unfortunately, I think that the $7.6 million is as high as it's going to get, because from here on, it's not a good story. With pension costs continuing to rise, I think this is going to be the hardest decision, I think, for the council, is how do we start to make sure that we don't have to start using the reserves to balance our budget. And I would also say, just another observation, if you look at the transient occupancy tax, which is, let's see, on page 5 of 9, you'll notice that there's about $158,000 a year, $160,000 a year. I look at positive things too. So I know that there's another hotel that's slated as something to develop in our community, and so you've got to think about the future and components of what's possible. So I look at the 158. We have the potential opportunity to add, $100,000 to $150,000 of additional revenue once that next project gets up, and we should be looking at it like that. And hopefully, staff will orient themselves that they continue to do to help get that project, which has made it through the Planning Commission and going, because as we can see, we could definitely use the 150 in the future. The other thing I would just say, I was interested in the utility users tax and kind of the variations going on, and I thought something that might be interesting to the rest of the council or the community as they listen to what we're talking about. Brett, Jason, if you wouldn't mind, could we talk a little bit about the utility users tax, both in the current, the next year forecast, and kind of some of the discussions that you've had? I know you talk about it a little bit in the report, but it's, utility users tax is our third largest revenue source, and I just would like to talk about this a little bit. Specifically, the electrical utility users tax.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that, Troy. So for electric utility users tax revenue, what the forecast actually assumes is the decline in on a cash basis that we saw during the first 6 months of the fiscal year, and even in January. We're projecting that we basically bounce back in February and on back to our normal pace that we've seen in prior years. And that's based upon information that Edison says that we should be able to forecast. They haven't provided us with any level of specificity, but they have indicated that they believe that the decline that we've seen is attributable to the credits that were applied to commercial accounts during that period of time from April, they say, to roughly November, but we've seen declines kind of up and down the board. And so there may be a mix of reasons why revenues are down. But then applying the forecast, then it was really just looking at the trends for the prior year and that baseline for those months, and then extrapolating it out. And then the same thing for 2017-18, taking that trend, backing out the anomaly for the decline in the rebates, assuming that we get back to that normal level, and then forecasting it out. So if that explains it.
Anything else, Troy?
Yeah, just a couple other things. So the charges for services, I guess just something I talked about staff a little earlier today, was that, that category, if I'm not mistaken, is a big portion of that is what we collect from our Parks and Recreation. And again, just, within our community, we know that we've lost the lease that's on the base for the pool, and our aquatics program is a really important program, and I think in there, this may be one of the highest that we've been able to achieve for charges for services. And I don't know if Corey from Parks and Recreation, if you have any comments, but I know in the next year, when you start looking at 17-18, we show a minimal decline, but I guess just from your perspective, knowing that you're responsible for a lot of the revenue in that category, could you talk a little bit about that? What you see for the next year, just kind of help us on our forecast, because eventually we got to look at that revenue and see how strong that is at the $1,078,000 that we found in our preliminary budget in 17-18. And again, that's on page 5 of 9.
Yes, thank you. The charges for services for the recreation department include the revenues for the pool. Everything is pretty status quo. Our numbers dropped a little bit this year, not tremendously, but with that comes a decrease in the expenditures. On the expenditure side, the expenditures are pretty equivalent to the revenues. I think our revenues over expenditures is in the $10,000 range or something like that. So as there's decline, if there's a decline or an increase in revenue or expenditures, likely the revenues and if revenues go up, expenditures will likely go up, and vice versa. If our expenditures go down, our revenues will go down. The aquatics division is very highly operated by part-time staff. That's our biggest expense there. So the more participation in swim lessons, the more staff we need, the more staff hours we need in the water. The less participation, obviously, the same thing, the less number of staff hours we have for the pool. So they're pretty equal in there, but it's I want to say around $150,000 to $200,000. So on both sides of the chart.
Anything else, Troy?
Yeah, just I guess kind of in closing, just to give a directional view, and I'm curious on the rest of the council's perspective. You know, when we look at 2017-18, and I know right now they're just getting a weather check with us of directionally how do we feel. But you know, like Councilmember Wilson, I'm sure Councilmember Kusumoto, we definitely want to try and keep a balanced budget, but I think you can start to see the pension activity mounting, and I think staff and the subcommittee with Councilmember Wilson and Councilmember Murphy have done a really good job of starting to be preemptive on what we're going to have to do to offset this huge amount of potential hit. I am supportive of the employment freeze for the next year. At a minimum, I think that's something that we'll have to do, and I think we need to be open to the fee study that I know we've talked about in our strategy discussions and our potential of trying to look for areas of opportunity, including using some of the reserves that we've worked so hard to get up to $7.6 million and determined what we need to do to kind of offset some of the financing costs that will be charged for having such a high unfunded pension. So with that, that's just my comments. And again, Mayor, I just appreciate any other comments. I'm very interested in hearing others' perspectives on where we go from here.
I didn't do it.
Did you hang up?
Uh-huh. I think so.
Well, this is Troy.
Okay. Can we finish real quick, or should we just?
Try them again.
Well, this is Troy.
It might be on his end. I haven't got anything from him yet, so it might be on his end.
Should I continue on, or should we wait? I'll just have my, when you're trying to get him back. I'll just throw my 2 cents in real quick. It's no different than Councilmember Wilson or Kusumoto's. I think we need to be aggressive on both gap closures and not just for the snapshot that we have now, because I think right now it looks really healthy, but addressing the elephant in the room of what we're going to have to be going through the next 4 to 5 to 6 years, I think this is really prudent. And we should explore anything that we can that won't interrupt day-to-day services, quality of life. And I think both of these items are real good and feasible to be able to do and to implement. Anything else on that? So are we doing,
It's just receive and file, right?
yeah, we have a roll call vote though.
Hello? Okay. One moment. Okay, Troy's back.
Are you back?
I am sorry.
There we go, no problem. Troy, I just made a quick comment that I agree with all the comments that have been made, that we just need to be aggressive on our gap closures, not just for the snapshot that we have today, but for future pension liabilities and future expenses. So I think aggressive is better on the gap closures. So, no, we have a roll call vote on this, but,
Only if direction was provided, so it's just a general receive and file. so
Okay.
roll call.
Yeah, at this point, we greatly appreciate your feedback, and we'll continue to dialogue through the process, and we'll meet with Budget Standing Committee. We also are planning on meeting with the actuary, our PERS actuary, and try to go hand in hand with the actuary in developing our long-term plan on what we're going to do to address the PERS liability in the future. So I think, we're really good at this point in terms of direction and feedback, and we'll keep the dialogue going through the budget process.
okay. Anything else? Okay, we're going to adjourn this meeting and start our regular meeting at 6. Meeting adjourned. Troy, I think I'm hanging up on you for a minute.